But this abhorrence, in fact, stems from ignorance of the nature of mediation and of absolute cognition itself. For mediation is nothing beyond self-moving self-sameness, or is reflection into self, the moment of the I which is for itself pure negativity, or, when reduced to its pure abstraction, simple becoming. The I, or becoming in general, this mediation, on account of its simple nature, is just immediacy in the process of becoming, and is the immediate itself. Reason is therefore misunderstood when reflection is excluded from the true, and is not grasped as a positive moment of the absolute. It is reflection that makes the true a result, but it is equally reflection that overcomes the antithesis between the process of its becoming and the result, for this becoming is also simple and therefore not different from the form of the true, which shows itself as simple in its result. The process of becoming is rather just this return into simplicity. Though the embryo is indeed in itself a human being, it is not so for itself. This it only is as cultivated reason, which has made itself into what it is in itself. And that is when it, for the first time, is actual. But this result is itself a simple immediacy, for it is self-conscious freedom at peace with itself, which has not set the antithesis on one side and left it lying there, but has been reconciled with it. There's a lot going on in this particular paragraph, number 21, and Hegel is starting out by talking about mediation, Vermittlung, which we've mentioned already. Here he's going to give us a much more clear characterization of it. I think that there can be a problem with this passage in taking what he says here as providing us with the once and for all definition of mediation, because there's more to it than he's telling you here. But what he is doing, at least, is telling us some things about what he means by this concept and why it's so important. So with that in mind, let's look at what he actually says. He says that mediation, he's got two ways of characterizing this. One in terms of the self and identity, and one in terms of this process of reflection, which is a negative process, as we've seen, a becoming other. So already there's a twofold becoming otherness here, right? There's, on the one hand, self-moving self-sameness, and concealed within that is the fact that in order for it to be self-same, there already has to be a kind of duality involved. In order to be same to myself, in order to be identical to my own identity, I have to set up my identity, I have to posit it as something over here, which then I am. And then I can ask myself the question, well, what the hell is this I over here? Is it just that over there? Why is it over here? And we can frame this in a number of different ways. So already in this formulation, there's a bit of alterity concealed. Here, clearly there's already alterity as soon as we start thinking about what the term reflection means for Hegel and this process of reflection into self. Mediation is both of these. What's really interesting about this that I think is worth pausing and reflecting on, again, a little bit of a pun there, is that when we think of mediation, when we think of media, things in the middle, something mediating another thing, we tend to think about these as if we've got A over here and B over here, and then the thing in the middle, and the thing in the middle is a third type of thing. So I talk to you, I'm a person, you're a person, through the medium of this camera that I'm looking at, and you're not seeing the camera, you're only seeing what the camera is actually showing you. So there's already like 4 terms there. Why is the camera there? Because I have set it up in order to film me going out to you. So in a way the camera, although it is, a device, it's something separate from me, it's in a way an extension of me so that I can reach you. That, I think, gives you a bit of a conception of what Hegel's trying to get at here. mediation is not just bringing in a third term, it involves the thing that is expressing itself, unfolding itself, acting, engaging in this self-moving self-sameness in the process of reflection into itself, in the process of becoming other to itself, in the process of recovering that alterity and overcoming the antithesis. So, he says, this is what people don't want to get because this is really messy and sticky and hard to grasp, so they'd rather have things be immediate, just straightforward. The problem is that reality doesn't work that way. And so whenever you're doing that, you're hiding the fact that you're actually mediating things all the time when you're doing that, and you're hiding from yourself the very process that you're doing. But you're also setting things up in such a way as to only inadequately grasp the realities that you're trying to grasp. So he says, the I, or becoming in general, this mediation on account of its simple nature, is just immediacy in the process of becoming. So we can look at this in an abstract way as just a matter of becoming. And when we talk about becoming, it seems like, well, we're talking about something that doesn't really have any being. Being and becoming are opposed to each other. Becoming is always the one that loses out. It's not as good ontologically. Hegel's saying that's what we call the immediate. But that's really quite abstract. What we want to take hold on, what we want to think about, is the absolute, or the true itself. And what we're not getting a lot of the time is that this is not something simple, that it already involves a process of reflection. And reflection involves all these things that we've already talked about, alienation. Here he actually talks in terms of reason. Reason itself is something dynamic. This is really important because if human beings are the rational animal, we're never fully rational until we reach the end of our development for Hegel. And the very process of realizing how we're irrational is a growth, or at least a potential growth, in rationality. We do that by reflection. So when I realize, man, I let my anger get away with me, and that turns me into a dummy, and then I do things that are irrational, that's a very concrete example of this process of reflection, which involves negation, saying, that's bad, I shouldn't be like that. And then that allows the possibility of transcending that, of going beyond that, of incorporating these lessons that we learn. So he says, it's reflection that makes the true a result. But it's equally reflection that overcomes the antithesis between the process of becoming, right, and the result, the thing that we want to look at. Because this becoming is also simple and therefore not different from the form of the true, which shows it is simple in its result. So it's through reflection, which is mediate, which takes place through this process of becoming other, through this process of being okay with everything not being totally wrapped up in a bow, not being totally clear, things not being as simple as you expect them to, requiring a process of inquiry, of activity on your part. It's through this process of reflection that we're able to bring all the parts together. What that means is, at least until we reach the end, we're never going to be completely finished. The results that we have along the way are stopping points where we could get stuck. They could become cul-de-sacs. But there's also going to be a beyond where we say, oh, man, there's still other things to do. This is going to happen through history, of course. It's not as if any one single person, until, of course, Hegel, thinks that they can jump through all of this stuff. And Hegel can only do it because mankind, humanity, has worked this out painfully, laboriously, through suffering, the patience of the negative, over the course of time. So he gives this example. The process of becoming is a return into simplicity. He says the embryo is indeed in itself a human being, but it's not so for itself. reflection isn't taking place yet. And it's not just with the attaining of rationality, Hegel says, that one becomes a human being. He says, it's only as cultivated reason, which has made itself into what it is in itself. That is when, for the first time, it is actual. This result is itself a simple immediacy, self-conscious freedom at peace with itself, which has not just set the antithesis over there and said, I'm not going to think about that, but has actually reintegrated that with itself. That's what it means to be, at least at this point in the game, to be fully rational, to be cultivated reason, according to Hegel. What has just been said can also be expressed by saying that reason is purposive activity, the exaltation of a supposed nature over a misconceived thinking, and especially the rejection of external teleology, has brought the form of purpose in general into discredit. Still, in the sense in which Aristotle too defines nature as purposive activity, purpose is what is immediate and at rest, the unmoved which is also self-moving, and as such is subject. Its power to move, taken abstractly, is being for itself or pure negativity. The result is the same as the beginning only because the beginning is the purpose. In other words, the actual is the same as its notion only because the immediate, as purpose, contains the self or pure actuality within itself. The realized purpose, or the existent actuality, is movement and unfolded becoming. But it is just this unrest that is the self, and the self is like that immediacy and simplicity of the beginning because it is the result, that which has returned into itself, the latter being similarly just the self. And the self is the sameness and simplicity that relates itself to itself. We need to be careful in approaching this section not to be too hasty to read into what he's talking about as reason, Vernunft, in terms of our own rationality or our theories about what reason is for human beings. Now, you could object and say, well, Hegel himself, in trying to discern what reason is for the absolute, and then perhaps talk about reason in human beings, he's a human being himself, so he's using reason lowercase r to understand reason uppercase r. There is a certain circularity or reflexivity involved there that is worth noting. So he says reason can be understood as purposive activity. All of what's been said here can also be expressed. Here's another way of saying it, by saying that reason is purposive activity. Zweckmäßige, that is activity which is oriented towards ends by finding means, by being the means. Mäßige. Oriented towards it, measured to it. We might even say determined to it. So he's going to say two things here that are particularly important. He's not going to really explore what that means to be purposive. That's going to come much later. As a matter of fact, there's an entire section of the phenomenology that's called reason, where we're going to explore this in great detail. He says, the first thing is, there's been a sort of reaction in modernity against the concept of purpose. And why? Well, because people who are talking in terms of ends or final causality or teleology were giving things a bad name. I mean, all you have to do is read somebody like Voltaire's Candide, and you'll see this sort of thing with Pangloss, eyeglasses. It's so fortunate that God designed the nose and the ears in such a way as to be able to support my spectacles. There were some people who looked at final causality in those sorts of ways, and they made it possible to sort of parody and say that's not really going to work. And so you see people like Descartes and Hobbes and many of the natural scientists of the time saying, we got to get rid of these Aristotelian notions of causality, the final causality, the purposive thing. We can understand that in terms of maybe intentions or subjective preferences, or pick whatever you like. But really, especially in the world of nature, we got to get rid of this conception of final causality, especially for physical things. So Hegel says, some of the way people have thought about this has brought the form of purpose in general into discredit. And he says, but in the sense in which Aristotle, too, defines nature as purposive activity, purpose is what is immediate and at rest, the unmoved, which is also self-moving, and as such is subject. So he's saying, look, Aristotle got this right. And actually other people who are following Aristotle, like the scholastics, like Leibniz talking about the need to reintroduce final causes, would be getting this right as well. That the nature of a subject is to engage in purposive activity. It may be that not all nature actually has this the way that we thought it does, but human beings are certainly introjecting this into at least their portion of existence. So far so good. So then he says, its power to move taken abstractly as being for itself or pure negativity, but we don't want to remain with the abstract, right? We never do. He says the result is the same as the beginning, only because the beginning is the purpose. So when we're engaging in this dialectical unfolding or unpacking of what the beginning is, leading up to the result, you could say that purposive activity is going to be the means by which we get from beginning to result. And remember, we've just talked about the whole and the true as being a result, as being this process of becoming other, and then becoming other again, and overcoming that, becoming other. So all of this would actually be understood as having some sort of teleology behind it. And to give away the spoiler, what is that teleology? For God through us, or the absolute through us, or reality, or the true, or the good through us and through human history, to come to fully know itself in its fully developed condition. That is, as us. Not as the screwed up human beings that we actually turn out to be, but as the dynamic whole that encompasses all of them. But that's going way far ahead. So he says, the realized purpose is movement and unfolded becoming. It's just this unrest, this process, the dynamic process, that is the self. And the self is like that immediacy and simplicity of the beginning, because it is the result, that which is returned into itself. And so this is the process of becoming, of development, and it's going to be inhabited throughout the entire thing by this purpose, by having some sort of teleological structure to it. That doesn't mean, I know I gave away the spoiler, but that doesn't mean that early on we actually know what the hell we're doing, or what it is that Spirit is trying to accomplish. As a matter of fact, if Hegel's wrong about where it went, we still don't fully know what it was trying to accomplish. But we do know that it is purposive, and we do know that thereby we can sort of like explore that and unpack that and look at our own involvement in it and figure out what the absolute is trying to do through the process of history. The need to represent the absolute as subject has found expression in the propositions God is the eternal, the moral world order, love, and so on. In such propositions, the true is only posited immediately as subject, but is not presented as the movement of reflecting into itself. In a proposition of this kind, one begins with the word God. This by itself is a meaningless sound, a mere name. It is only the predicate that says what God is, gives him content and meaning. Only in the end of the proposition does the empty beginning become actual knowledge. This being so, it is not clear why one does not speak merely of the eternal, of the moral world order, and so on, or, as the ancients did, of pure notions, like being, the one, and so on. In short, of that which gives the meaning without adding the meaningless sound as well. But it is just this word that indicates that what is posited is not a being, that is, something that merely is, or essence, or a universal in general, but rather something that is reflected into itself, a subject. But at the same time, this is only anticipated. The subject is assumed as a fixed point to which, as their support, the predicates are affixed by a movement belonging to the knower of this subject, and which is not regarded as belonging to the fixed point itself. Yet it is only through this movement that the content could be represented as subject. That the way in which this movement has been brought about is such that it cannot belong to the fixed point. Yet, after this point has been presupposed, the nature of the movement cannot really be other than what it is, can only be external. Hence, the mere anticipation that the absolute is subject is not only not the actuality of this notion, but it even makes the actuality impossible, for the anticipation posits the subject as an inert point, whereas the actuality is self-movement. Section 23 is one that I think is particularly clear and easy to follow, but I'm going to lead you through it anyway, because perhaps maybe it isn't. So let's actually look at what he's saying. To begin with, I want to note an ambiguity and a sort of transition that's taking place here. He says, the need to represent the absolute as subject. Now, we've talked about why it's important to not only understand the absolute as substance, but as subject. And what do we mean when we say subject? Well, that can mean more than one thing. So before we were talking about the absolute as subject, as being like us, we're subjects, and we act upon or are acted upon by objects or by other subjects. We have a certain agency. We are, as Aristotle says, self-movers. Hegel loves that idea. And the absolute itself, the totality that we're all within, is also a subject in that sense. But we can also talk about subjects in terms of grammar and in terms of logic. The subject, when we say subject, verb, object, we can also say subject, copula, predicate. And it's that sense that Hegel is going to be playing off here. So he says the need to represent the absolute as subject has found expression in propositions like God is X, where X could be the eternal, the moral world order, love, and then he has, etc. Whatever it is that you want to throw in there. You could even take, stuff that's sort of anti-theistic. God is the worst idea anyone ever came up with. God is the big guy in the sky. God is the flying spaghetti monster. God is a figment in the imagination of theists worldwide. No matter what you're doing, you're carrying out the same process that Hegel is talking about here, where you're giving this some sort of content by what you affix after the is. So he says, the word God by itself is a meaningless sound, a mere name. It's only the predicate that says what God is. Even if the predicate is just is, to say God has necessary being, or God, so the very nature of God to exist, that would be, and that's what Hegel will make out of the ontological proof at a certain point. That would be to say that is becomes the predicate that tells you what this thing over here is. Otherwise, you might just say gooblabooblaba, or make up some other sound, jinky jinky, You could put anything you like over here. It's what matters. What matters is going to be what you put on this side. So he says the predicate gives content and meaning. Only at the end of the proposition does the empty beginning become actual knowledge. So we say, for example, God is the absolute. Sounds good. Now we know what God is. Sort of. What the hell's the absolute? Well, the absolute is God, you see. What's God? God's the absolute. There's some things that if we stick in there, it's going to be, rather circular. As a matter of fact, if you think about it, I am what I am, or I am the one who is, from Exodus, would not be particularly helpful at this stage in the game, other than to say, that God is like the fullness of being or something like that. But we still don't have a good conception of what that means yet. So notice that mediation has come in here. The predicate mediates the subject for us. It helps us understand what the subject is supposed to be. So he says, only at the end of the proposition does the empty beginning become actual knowledge. Now, if this is the case, he says, it's not clear why you don't just speak merely of the eternal, of the moral world order, and so on. Or, as the ancients did, of pure notions like being, the one, and so on, in short of that which gives the meaning without adding the meaningless sound as well. So one thing you could do is just say, all right, get rid of this. Now we're just going to focus on this. But then you're posed with the problem. Great, what's that then? No matter what we pick, whether it's the one, the form of the good, the eternal, the eternity itself, the moral world order, whatever we're going to pick that's going to be an absolute, we're going to run into this issue with. So, he says, it's just this word that indicates what is posited is not a being, that is something that we can just encounter, something that merely is, or essence, or universal in general, but rather something that is reflected into itself, a subject. And now notice we've shifted back from the subject of a predicate to, where we've got the mediation taking place through the predicate, to something which is now reflected into itself, the subject as agency, the process of reflection, the realization of its own negativity. And this think about it, sort of magnetically sucking in the predicate, this process of reflection, once it becomes self-aware enough, realizes that it makes sense of the subject through the predicate. So it also begins to realize the problems with this subject-predicate form itself. Is the subject, like Hegel says, really a fixed point on which we can hang all these predicates? Sort of like, I'm a fixed point on which we have a tie, and a jacket, and a shirt, and an undershirt, and pants. We can go down the list. Glasses, hair, skin. Start getting under that. Muscle, bone. Start taking away all these things. It's sort of like peeling an onion. It's not that Hegel wants to do as the move, though. He wants to say, look, the nature of subjectivity, not only for us human beings, but for the subject that is the absolute, that is God, that is the divine, that is all these other great things, works itself out through this process of positing, of otherness, of mediation. That's what's going on here. So he says, it's only through this movement that the content could be represented as subject. The way in which this movement has been brought about is such it cannot belong to the fixed point. So the mere anticipation that the absolute is subject is not only not the actuality of this notion, it even makes the actuality impossible. What he's showing us here is how to avoid a dead end. For the anticipation posits the subject as an inert point, whereas the actuality is self-movement. If we want to think about God, substance, being itself, whatever it is we want to put in that top slot where spirit is going to go, it's got to be something that is intrinsically active, self-othering, working through mediation, And it has to do so through these predicates or positings that then reveal something new about the subject. So the subject is not merely an inert point that we take for granted, but something that discovers itself on the way.